Well, thank you all again for being here today. So we have a very different panel from the first panel, which I thought was really excellent and sharp. But we are not going to be talking about China and India. We're going to take a step back um, for a change and look at China and what's happening in China. And not just that, but reading China, the challenges in studying the country, especially specific to Indian scholars and Indian students and Indian researchers. And also ask the question of what it will take for India to develop a deeper, nuanced understanding and public discourse on China, which I'm sure we can figure out in 15 minutes. Uh, and also ask where China is headed. I think we couldn't have asked for a better panel who've been introduced. Ambassador Gokhale, you left China after your first stint, I think 2 years after 1989. And I think your second stint began a day after the death of Deng Xiaoping in 1997. So you seem to have had a sense of timing to be there for two monumental events. And you were there for further periods as well, as we know, in Beijing, in Taiwan. And you went back as ambassador as well when I had the good fortune of first meeting you in Beijing. Um, a broad question to begin with, for all the time that you've spent there in these various periods, how much has being on the ground impacted the way you think about China and the way you write about China today? What difference has it made to you in your study of China?
Ananth, it's made an enormous difference. If you don't visit China, you have a very unreal view of China, particularly Indians, because we seem to get all our information from the audiovisual media, and the audiovisual media is sensational and often prejudiced. I think two fallacies that we have of China is something that one gets disabused of very quickly when one goes to China. The first is that China has grown as fast as it has simply because it's an autocratic regime and they can knock down buildings to build bridges or airports, whereas we can't as a democracy. You learn very quickly there that this is a cadre based party which takes political risk. And you mentioned we were all there, Mr. Menon and I, during the Tiananmen incident. The instinctive reaction of a country when, or a government or a party when faced with a challenge is to back off from doing things. And what they were doing was economic reform. Whereas, in fact, in this case, the Chinese government doubled down and said we will do reform even faster. So we have to give credit to the Chinese government for doing things which sped the economy into the direction it has gone, and should not simply assume that it is simply autocracy which has led to development. The second is, I think they discovered the idea of competitive federalism many, many years before our current prime minister has spoken about it. Provinces competed with and still compete with each other. And it is that which led to growth. So it wasn't a top down effort, it was an effort by every single provincial governor and party secretary and district level official to actually attract labor, foreign investment, capital, and technology. And that's what has grown the economy, something that we have now begun to do. And you can only realize this when you actually visit China.
A related question, since we have a lot of students, including civil service aspirants, who are following this event, and so some of the specific sort of challenges that we have in the study of China is you have the language problem, you have a problem of access. So, what is your sense in terms of, say, students or researchers who are embarking on this? What would be your points of advice to them to put them in the right direction to you? Yes.
No, I think language is not as much of a problem because I presume with artificial intelligence now you can actually translate a lot of Chinese literature. I think the problem is we don't have scholarship in our country, and therefore we tend to base all our assessments on Western perceptions of China. They're outstanding, very well researched, but unfortunately they are from a Western perspective, and that's not necessarily a perspective which applies to us. So I think we really, if we have to build a set of researchers, and there are two here who are really outstanding because they're bringing an entirely new approach. We have to encourage these people like them or Santosh and Pranay and Amit. And the only way we can encourage them is to give them jobs. If after all the effort they've put in learning Chinese, nobody's going to give them a job, we're not going to have an Indian perspective. So I really think here is where business has to step up. It's not government's job to employ them. It's business which should use such people to promote, of course, business abroad, but also to promote the culture of study of China in India.
So I hope they're listening and watching. Um, so, Ms. Suri, what I find so interesting about your work is I think you're among few Indians who have spent a lot of time looking at Chinese society, at Chinese culture. You've written several books about this. I find it interesting that when we speak of China, we tend to often think of foreign policy issues, economic issues, political issues. Can you speak a little bit about why it's so important to also look at social issues and what's happening in China to understand everything else that's going?
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So, as you said, we've heard a lot about geopolitics, about border issues, and everything. But what I found when we were in China was that we didn't know much about the people, about their way of thinking, and neither did they know about us. And that was very important because once you start finding out the connections, the historical connections, and the others, it becomes, it. I would feel that it brings communities together, and I would feel that it would be a launching pad for cooperation and collaboration for the future, which I hope will work. So my observations when we were in China were, I'll just tell you a little bit about that. And then after that, I've been going there every year almost for conferences and seminars, and I've seen how things are going and meeting the same people and getting a way of, an idea of their emotions, the way they think. And I realized that there were a lot of connections, a lot of common factors. Also, there were differences, but I thought that this was very important that we should know about the communities and the society, Chinese society. So, this is a very basic, down to earth kind of investigation. And I think, ultimately, what is it that matters in the economy? It's the factors of production, that's labor, capital, entrepreneurship. And this is what it is. It's human beings who make all these things. So it's very important to know what is going on in their minds, and for us to also, for them to know what kind of people we are. So my aim was to get the connections together, to search for the historical connections, to find out the cultural commonalities and the religious commonalities, and also, the kind of thoughts that are going on at the moment. So this is the reason why I decided to do this. And when we were there, it was interesting. Every time I would wear a sari, people would like to take photographs with me in Tiananmen Square. I remember a lot of people did that. And there were a lot of Bollywood, there was a lot of Bollywood music. We went on a trip to Xinjiang and we stopped outside a village. And what did we hear? That was Bollywood music playing. Shah Rukh Khan, Rani Mukherjee were very popular. And I went for a writer's workshop to Lushan, it's a mountainous area. And there were a lot of people over there. And one Chinese young lady put on Bollywood music on her phone and said, "Please dance to it." So, for them, it was Bollywood is very popular. Amir Khan is very popular. I went for the Dialogue of Civilizations conference, and there was Amir Khan with a whole lot of fans. Jack Ma was also there, but Shah Rukh Khan is also very popular. So I realized how they are very curious about Indians. We went to Sichuan, Chengdu, and there was a young lady. We went on an official trip when my husband was busy with, the governance. And then this lady, the young student, was given the job of taking me around. And so she took me around, and then she said, "You are my Indian mother." This lady was then posted as an officer in the Indian embassy in Delhi. and they were very curious. She and her husband wanted to know a lot of things. I understood why this happened. Okay, why do Indians have such big eyes? So I explained to them how we used to make kajal. Okay, what is datun? So I told them about the neem tree, and he said, I'm going to Chandni Chowk to look for that. And later on, I discovered that in China, they grew a lot of neem trees. So there were many, many trips like that, and we went to Xinjiang, where in Urumqi there was where they were selling samsas, which are actually samosas. So many connections with our Indian way of thinking. And then it was in Loyang. There's a White Horse Temple. I don't know if some of you may have been there. That was the first Buddhist temple which the emperor had set up, and what he saw was a golden figure in the sky, and he sent some Chinese to India to find out. He asked them, what was this? It's a Buddha. So there were two monks who came from India on white horse, on the white horses, Kashyap Matanga and Dharmaratna, and this uh, temple was set up. And then there was an agreement between Prime Minister Vajpayee and Weng Chepao in 2003 to set up an Indian temple, which was right next to that. And so, there are lots of commonality, lots of, connections, and how Buddhism came from India. Although when I went to the Phai Yuan temple and spoke to the director, he said that China is the center of the Buddhist world. And I was taken aback. But this is obviously soft power. They wanted to do this, can have this connection. And I spent time with the monks sitting over there and listening to them. One of them was a Sanskrit expert. So there were lots of these things happening, and it's just an idea to give you observations about
I think it's really
why.
valuable because it's a dimension that we often don't get, and I want to come back to you on this. And because we often get the impression sometimes that when we are discussing China, um, whether it's in TV studios or wherever, that sometimes it seems like a conversation we're having amongst ourselves without putting a lot of attention into what's happening there. And Antara, I think what's interesting about your work is you focus almost solely on Chinese language sources, and you pay a lot of attention to what the debates in China are, not just about India, but China's view of the world and China's foreign policy. So, can you speak a little bit about your work, um, and in the process of the work that you do, how is looking at these sources challenged maybe some of the assumptions that you previously held?
Okay. Thank you, Ananth, first for having me for this discussion and also for including my chapter for this important book project. Your question is about research methodology. When it comes to research on China, the main emphasis in India as well as outside is on official sources, official handouts, state media, and so on and so forth. The key argument is that China, being an authoritarian one party state, media is highly censored. So there exists very little space for internal debates and discussions, and hence the official discourse is the most credible way to go about it. Also the language problem, it prevents us from taking a peek into what is happening in the Chinese society. But for me, I've studied and also lived in China for some time, and I have personally experienced uh, the space for internal debates and discussions that exist in Chinese society despite all the restrictions. One can really see very lively debates happening in China, in Chinese university campuses, in Chinese social media, private media, and other spaces, sometimes under pseudonyms, sometimes under cryptic messages and symbolisms, so all those things are there, but there is a space for debate. And as a part of my research, I study these debates and discussions happening within China by mostly by scanning Chinese media, Chinese think tank publications, and also other scholarly works. And through that, I tend to ascertain or to understand the overall mood of the nation, the public sentiment. And I have seen more than once that public sentiment in China has a direct impact on Chinese policy making or China's relation with particular countries. And one example, there was one brief example I can give is the Chinese export control policy towards India. And, since 2020, I saw the recurrent theme uh, in Chinese discussions have been India's potential rise and its gradual emerging advantages in economic and geopolitical fields, and what kind of impact it can have on China. So there would be lots of discussion on questions like: Is India's growing population and economic growth going to harm China? Will we see an India which is more, which has more confidence to confront China at the LSE or in the Indian Ocean region? Will India's rapid economic growth means that whether it will lead India to have a permanent seat in the UNSC? These kind of questions being deliberated, discussed upon, and such discussions actually picked pace after 2023, when India's population overtook China. So, I remember by 2022, end of 2023, beginning, there were a lot of noise in Chinese strategic circles about demanding the Chinese government to put restrictions on Chinese investments in India, or to prevent Chinese companies from establishing complete, industrial chain in India. And within 1 or 2 years, I could see that that public sentiment got reflected in Chinese policy making towards India. So I think this is one space maybe we can build up more expertise on.
I
Yeah,
think you
so
were ahead of the curve, even more so than Indian companies were. So I think that's what's so interesting about the work you do and the work that Veda does as well. Since we've all spent a lot of time talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese projects abroad in a very theoretical academic sense, but you actually go to some of those projects in Africa, especially, and you see firsthand how Chinese investment is playing out, uh, the impact it has on local communities, and the dialogue between China and its partner countries, which we also sometimes forget actually is a two-way street that happens. So, can you share a little bit about what your experience has been, for instance, visiting Chinese companies or Chinese projects in overseas countries? And a similar question that I posed to Antara, how it kind of challenged the way you sort of assumed how Chinese diplomacy works abroad and how you write about it.
Thank you, Ananth. Thank you for having me, and also this panel. It's wonderful to be part of this. I think it's very similar to what she was saying. A lot of assumptions are, I think what Sir was also saying, a lot of assumptions are questioned the minute you hit the ground. Because I think I'm part of a subset of China studies, which is called the study of global China, right? China and third regions. And often the narratives in global China studies is broad, it's meta, it's macroscopic. And once you hit the field, I think one of the things that it urges you to do is take that meta analysis and immediately contextualize it in a very specific region. And that does many things. But one of the things it does, for instance, is it kind of helps you see gaps between policy literature and what's actually happening on the ground. For instance, one of the projects I did with Ambassador Kanta at ICS, we studied specific assets in Tanzania. And one of the core components of BRI, for instance, was tech transfer, that it was going to be, transferring knowledge and tech to local engineers. But when we studied a lot of these projects and we were observing these engineers, there were Chinese engineers who spoke Mandarin and no English, and Tanzanian engineers who spoke Swahili and no Mandarin. And yet, tech transfer was theoretically happening, right? And I look at a lot of their project papers and things, it was all in Mandarin. So I think a lot of gaps between what we went from here thinking and what is actually happening on the ground, there were quite a bit of mismatch. But also the role of the African stakeholders, like you mentioned, right? Meeting with local experts, geographers, political scientists, who don't necessarily write often in Western journals that we are sort of, we read. So just listening to them talk about China is such a different take from scholars in DC or Delhi talking about China, right? Because a lot of the baggage doesn't exist. In a lot of these geographies, China is the alternative. So if you, as a Indian scholar, are talking to them, the question for you is, what is the value proposition that India is bringing to the table? So again, a very different lens of seeing China, or the perception of China. And then, of course, the fragmentation of this idea of China. There were state-owned enterprise officials we were speaking to, private sector enterprises, microscopic entrepreneurs that we were speaking to, who were there for very short bursts of time, some who had been living there for decades together. So again, this idea that it isn't a monolith, that there's so many fragments within understanding and studying China, and the heterogeneity of it. And then I think the biggest question as a researcher is the questions that we asked changed, because I think the time horizons shifted once we went to the ground. For instance, we'd read about these mega BRI projects that had been announced, and a lot of the analysis is on the financing of it, who's building it, who's designing it, who's subcontracting it. But when we go to the ground, a lot of the concerns were around who's going to maintain this 10 years from now. These internet data centers that are being run by Chinese engineers now, who's going to run it 10 years from now? So I think those kind of sustainability, viability questions came up a lot more. But in terms of challenges, there's the obvious logistical challenges. There's also the challenge of establishing trust, right? Why is this Indian girl in Mombasa asking sensitive questions about China to Chinese officials? So the first 20 minutes goes in just establishing trust and saying, I'm not a spy, which I've often been asked if I was. And also there is then, for me, I think the bigger thing was balancing the ethnographic depth with the broader geopolitical framing. Because recently for CSEP, we've been doing these series of studies on critical minerals. And I was in Zimbabwe and we were visiting these critical mineral lithium mines, for instance. And the stories that come out of this, right? The one liner would be, nothing about the green energy transition is green. And you kind of sucked into these stories of communities, of engineers, of projects, but you kind of have to take a step back and say, and not get, enamored by those stories and say, I still have to sort of bring in a geopolitical lens to this. That is a little bit of a challenge, I think, especially for a sucker for stories like me.
No, very interesting, yes. And I think it also goes to show how much that we write in theory, you have to go and see for yourself what's actually playing out on the ground.
Can I just add another anecdote to this? I was in Switzerland because, of course, that's where you go to talk about Africa and Asia. And there was this scholar, this gentleman from a country that I will not name, and he spoke very passionately about the Kenya, the standard gauge railway that went from Nairobi to Mombasa, a train that I had taken multiple times. And he had all these allegations about how the Chinese were getting it wrong. It's completely manned by Chinese and all of these things. And he spoke with such confidence that I kind of, double questioned my own findings from the study. And then I wrote down a few things, and then I meekly sort of put my hand up and I said, I had a few questions. And then I said, I was on this train 3 months ago, and a lot of what you said doesn't add up. So when were you on the train? Not only was he not on the train, he had never even been to Kenya. And I had written a fantastic paper on the SGR. So I think that's just to say we need to, a lot of our scholarship has to come from understanding from the ground.
Absolutely. And one question I want to pose to all of you, but in a slightly different way to each of you, is I think one of the hardest questions that we have when writing about China is looking at the future and crystal gazing, which is something you don't want to do because inevitably you'll be wrong, but something that you can't shy away from. In your essay, this book, Ambassador Gokhale, you speak about an excellent essay where you speak about comparisons of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party of China, and you look at how in the reform period in China, in the Deng Jiang Hu Jintao years, as China moved away from its earlier political model, how many of those points of relevance diminished. But what I want to ask you is what we're seeing now in China in the Xi Jinping years, in some way perhaps makes us once again review the assumptions that we built over the last 20, 30 years. So can you speak about that in terms of these trends that we see as we look to the future and where you see things going?
Yeah, Ananth, I think one of the misperceptions we have is that it is President Xi Jinping which is making China great again. I think it really is the Chiang Zemin Hu Jintao era when China rose. And it rose for two reasons. One was economic decentralization and therefore the growth of the economy. But the second was the relative relaxation of controls on society, which allowed for an explosion of ideas, of innovation, which has led to this research and development that brings China to the front ranks of modern science. I believe that President Xi Jinping's policies of trying to control society and re-centralize power is in fact strangling that effort. Now, I can't tell you to what extent it is being strangled, but I think that unless you allow that relative freedom to exist, I think innovation will also begin to have face problems in China. So I think that's one area we should be looking out for. The second area is I think we just assume that because it is a one party state, it's going to be stable. But if you look at the history of the Communist Party, the only time two political transitions have been done without any kind of problem are when there were rules introduced that a president can only be in power for 10 years, which is 2002 when Chiang Zemin handed over to Hu Jintao and 2012 when Hu Jintao handed over to Xi Jinping. Before that, Mao's successor didn't succeed. Deng's two successors fell by the wayside, and he was forced to take a third, which was not his man. And President Xi has removed all age and term limits. So what we're looking at is an aging autocrat with no successor. And I think we know from politics that eventually there are going to be factional struggles as the man gets older and older, and you look at the transition beyond that. So that's the second thing we have to look at. The third thing is, I think two red flags have gone up for me in the last 24 months. Uh, there was a catastrophic collapse of COVID policy. One day there were barriers being set up. The next day there was nothing happening on COVID, and of course thousands or tens of thousands died as a result of that. I'm not really bothered about that. What I think we should be concerned, not concerned, what we should be looking at is that this is a state which spends more on the surveillance of its own people than it does on the external security, that is the PLA and looking at India and Vietnam. They couldn't sense the mood of the people. There were people coming out with white paper demonstrating as the government. This heavily surveilled state couldn't decide the mood of the people. What does it say about that state? Similarly, you purge half your military leaders, all of whom have been appointed by you, whether it's on corruption or not. Then where is your vetting of these leaders? Is your control, if your control is so absolute, surely you knew these leaders were corrupt or filling their rockets with water rather than fuel. If you didn't know that, what does it say about your regime? So I think we need to look at these aspects because surely it can't be all cannot be hunky dory in any country. We've tended to give China the benefit of doubt. Conversely, we've always tended to doubt India's political system. But actually, we are the far more stable entity in Asia, not the Chinese. So I think really these are areas we need to look at.
On the last sort of observation you made, how do you sort of look at? You just mentioned you've had the removals of uh, you had a foreign minister, and then you had several generals as well, who are obviously seen as being close to President Xi. So there are obviously two ways of interpreting his decision to remove some of these people. One argument would be that it shows a position of strength or a signal that even people close to him will be disciplined. Or the flip side, which you kind of the conventional wisdom that it's all usually portrayed as him being weakened. Is it something that's just impossible to tell given how it works, or where would you sort of sit on these two sides of
I'd
explanation?
say that when a regime is tightening security, then it is an insecure regime.
Good point. A similar question to you, Ms. Suri, in terms of a slightly different way, in terms of where China is going. In your chapter, you look at the evolution of state-society relations from the Mao years to the openness in the reform period and to what we're seeing now. Since we're running out of time, just what would you sort of share as brief observations of the current Gen Z in China, and what do you think kind of makes them different from previous generations?
So the Gen Z, which is, young people who were born from 95 to 2010, these are the ones who have grown up in a different China. You know, it's all digital, there's social media, and the way of thinking is quite different. So they've worked very hard and they expected to get good jobs, but there's a lot of unemployment, and they are frustrated, and they're not happy with what's going on. And as Xi Jinping said, eat bitterness, which means deal with it, do what you want. Some of them have, as we know, they're called the lying backs, generation, 996, which means 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. And they are fed up of that. So they expected that they would get good jobs, and it wouldn't be so stressful for them. But I think now they are doing a lot of research on these human resource management, and which I have read a lot about. And they're trying to, change things a bit. They haven't yet done it, but they're thinking about it. Flexible working hours, and for example, temporary jobs like the gig economy in all over the world. They're doing things which they would like to do, and when and where they want to do that. And some of them are just going to the villages and living there. Some are going to temples and just sitting there and enjoying their peace. And some of them are going back to families and just living there as children as they grew up. So if this is something they should be concerned about. This generation is the one which will come up and will take over. So I think what the flexible working hours they're thinking of is, to sort of give them a chance to live their lives as they want. They don't want to get married because they cannot afford these houses and everything. Now there's a two set side marriage, which means that there is the woman will live with her parents, the husband will live with his parents. They will have a child which will grow up. One will grow up with the woman family and one with the man's family, and they will have different surnames so that the woman can work, the man can work, and the child will be looked after. And they could meet once in a while. So there are all kinds of things. Now they're also registering children who are actually born, without, the parents being married. So this is all about demography. This they wanted to have the one-child policy changed to the two-child and now the three-child policy. But now the Gen Z is something that they should be concerned about, and I think they might make changes for them because they can't afford this. So this is something which they probably will handle. And the thing is that in the Communist Party, okay, the Gen Z looks at the world and sees democracy, but in China they have this social engineering, I would call it, the curating and of changing things to look like as though the party is actually looking after the society. So they've been brought up like that, to think like that. So they will not, it's not just about dissent and being angry about it. I think they'll probably settle something if they change that thing. They need to give them proper respect. This generation has been brought up with some self-confidence, dignity. They know they have their mental health problems, so they need to they want to know the exact role that they have in the job that they get, and to be given the good respect and a community which is kind to them. So
Well, that's what I liked about your essay as well, since you sort of weave in and out over the last 30, 40 years and how expectations among people in China have changed as well. And very briefly to the both of you as well, um, Antara, if you could speak a little bit about just looking ahead. You're also seeing a new generation of people in China who are India watchers, who write about India and think about India in some ways very different from what you've seen previously. So could you just speak very briefly a little bit about what you see as changing going forward?
So in the last session, we briefly spoke about how the overall negative, perception of India that is there in China, that they don't treat us equal, or they have some kind of contempt, towards India. And many scholars have actually written about this, and they have given very important reasons behind it, including not so good exchanges between India and China during colonial times, China's own growth and development thereafter, China emerging as a global power, and the power asymmetry that exists between India and China, and also partly because the Chinese Communist Party's own survival tactic, against democratic tendencies within Chinese society. So, all these things have culminated into China having an attitude of, say, dismissiveness towards India or India's interest. Um, but I see a change there. I see an interesting change happening, an important trend, coming in. Generations of Chinese people, they have grown up thinking that India is a retreating image, as Ambassador Saran has written, that it's a retreating image in China's rearview mirror. But they are perplexed by when news pours in saying that, India has become world's fourth largest economy, or it has become the second largest steel producer, or, for example, the scale of mobile payments in India is twice that of Alipay. So there are a lot of questions about what is India actually, where does India stand, and what is its place in China's strategic outlay. So my chapter tries to capture this changing trend in Chinese public perception of India, and bring out various nuances to the India debate in China. I have listed some prominent voices in China who are of the opinion that disdain for India is not helping China as much. It doesn't help in having healthy development of China-India relations, and also to maintain overall stability of China's periphery. Um, it is also argued that China needs to face up to the reality of the importance of the India relationship to China, and not get misled by, contempt or anger. For example, if you follow the economic debate in China, you would know how concerned they are about the existing economic model in China. um, uh, I think Mr. Pai talked about the overcapacity in China and how Chinese companies are looking for new markets. And at the time when the market is actually shrinking for China because of great power competition, and this makes India a critical market for Chinese businesses. And many of the Chinese businesses are of the opinion that India will become one of the only three independent big markets of the world. Um, After the US and China, with market size and development opportunities ahead of other countries. And also, what makes Indian market important for the Chinese companies is that it is the only large market where local competition is not so much, and also there is, the consumption is only going to increase. So all these things, makes Chinese enterprises very keen to be on in the Indian market.
You see more attention, and not just looking at the political side, but also at India's economy and
Yes, and apart from economy, on political aspect as well, many people in China believe that the cross-strait relation, or the cross-strait unification, can only happen if they take India into confidence. So there are many ways, many geopolitical angles through which they believe that having a workable India relationship is good for China. And this is this new trend in Chinese thinking on China that I have tried to highlight in my chapter, and hope it will provide nuance to the notion that exists in India that China looks down upon India.
I'm sure it will. There's lots more angles as well, so you'll have to read it for yourself. And quickly, Veda, just to put you on the spot in terms of where you look at China Global South a lot. So where do you see this engagement, this relationship going? One of the things that you write about in your chapter and in your other writings is that often we kind of dismiss the agency of global South countries that are dealing with China. Often it's a two-way relationship. You're seeing the expectations of China change as well. So, just in 2 minutes, where do you see China's foreign policy going in the future?
Thanks, Ananth. I was afraid you'll say 30 seconds. Um, so I think the short answer is that, this one-way provision that we've seen in China Global South relations, I think that's going to change. I think it's going to be fragmented, it's going to be negotiated and highly contested. We already see this. Countries like Zambia and Ghana are pausing agreements that they had signed, and they're going back to reassess terms. Other countries like the Bagamoyo port in Tanzania, which is a huge BRI project, was again paused, and completely all of the terms were renegotiated. Initially, I think it was supposed to be on a 99-year lease. It was supposed to be had a bunch of tax holidays and a condition that Tanzania would not develop any further ports in the country. And then Magufuli completely paused it. They made public the loan agreement, which caused a huge public conversation and pushback. And then now they've renegotiated to 33-year lease, the ability to build additional ports and so on and so forth. So you see this a lot happening. A lot of projects that were signed 20 years ago perhaps wouldn't be. And that is because of the expectation change from the global South countries, from expectation on capacity building, local value addition, what is the economic incentive, employment opportunities. And I think this puts additional pressure on Chinese actors to be more accountable, right, in a way that wasn't there perhaps 20 years ago. And also with this, there is the fact, and I think a lot of chapters in the book talk about the fact that China itself is changing. So the kind of checkbook diplomacy we saw in the early 2000s is perhaps not going to happen anymore. We already see funding levels coming down. But there's a lot of conversation around how projects are going to be more selective, more strategic, more specific to countries. And therefore, the role of these countries to then step up and bargain and negotiate better deals and so on. So I think the short answer to your question is, I think it's not going to be the way we've seen in the last 20 years. It's going to be very much negotiated and contested.
It was a really good 2-minute answer, so thank you. The final word to you, Ambassador Clay. I have to ask a question on India and China to end this. To end this, I know you. I think you once compared it to a tooth extraction, but I will, but I will do that anyway. But we are obviously at a new moment in the relationship. There's opportunities and challenges as well. So I would just like your thoughts. Where do you see this new moment going as we try and figure out how to engage with China?
Well, I think as the previous panel said, it's a tactical thing we are doing in engaging China because we have to, because it's important for our own national security and economy. I think there are a lot of problems between us, and those are underpinned by the fact that there is a breakdown in trust. Let's see if trust grows. If that does, perhaps we might move forward on some of the issues which Manoj dealt with in an essay, which is the boundary questions. But at this stage, I think we need to be realistic. It's more optics and less substantive. That's at least my view.
I think that's succinct and sharp as always. Thank you so much to the panelists. If you have questions, I think some of them will be here, so you can approach them after the panel is over. So we are winding up this event. Please join me in thanking this fantastic panel. Thank you.